Our trip to the Scandinavian capitals began just after Labor Day, with a flight to Detroit, then Amsterdam, and then Bergen, Norway. We met our guide for the next 2 weeks, Per Torsander.
Scandinavia, what connects us is the location, the language, the history. Finland and Russia, of course, and the Baltic states. We have 3 Baltic states also, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. They are another part of the Baltic Sea. Yes. The Baltic states. But Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark.
Bergen is in the southwest part of Norway, in fjord country, on the North Atlantic Sea, not far from Norway's oil fields. Our hotel was right on the historic Old Wharf waterfront, so we began our tour with walking around to take in the cold but damp but beautiful charms of Bergen. We enjoyed the World Heritage Site of Grieg, being rebuilt in the old hand-tooled way. The next day, we visited the home of world-famous classical composer Edvard Grieg, born in 1843. The museum here is on a beautiful, serene, and secluded spot in one of many little bays around Bergen.
For his cultural contribution, but mainly for his insane ego.
Did he have many kids he left around?
No, he didn't. No, at least not that we know of. And the Grieg clan in general is very big.
Grieg is buried nearby on the grounds in an unusual cliffside spot, safe from the ocean. Our next stop was in a city park where the Fantoft Stave Church has been built. It is a faithful reproduction of a medieval, all-wood Christian church. Wood is the preferred building material because the entire country is forested and it's inexpensive. Most of the time, it's easier to build from scratch than to rebuild in case of a fire. The main attraction of Bergen is its closeness to its world-famous fjords. We got on a train into the mountains and then a scenic bus ride to Flam to catch a quiet electric cruise boat to enjoy the fjord itself. A short hop flight from Bergen took us to Oslo, Norway's capital, for one night. A nice clean hotel near the downtown allowed us to walk to the bay to see the sights there. Then we saw the world-famous Nobel Peace Center. The actual Peace Prize is awarded in the Oslo City Hall, an ornately decorated hall nearby. The arts do well in the colder climate. This is the National Theatre Arts Center, home of Henry Ibsen. And this is the National Opera House. The National Art Museum features many world-famous artists, including the work of native son Edvard Munch. A unique spot is the Vigeland Sculpture Garden, a one-man park built over a 10-year period from 1924 to 1943. It covers 80 acres with 212 bronze and granite sculptures. Last but not least is the Oslo Viking Ship Museum, featuring the Oseberg ship, unearthed in a burial mound on a Norwegian farm in 1926. The owner of the ship, his belongings, and his 2 wives were also buried with him.
They say that originally they went to find a new place to live, to find new land. Actually, there is, first of all, it's hard with agriculture in this country because of the weather. But for example, in the area of Norway, when we talk about Vikings, we talk about the whole of Scandinavia, but for example, here in Norway, we have only 3% agricultural land. There's a lot of forest, but agricultural land, we have very little. So they wanted to try their luck with other places.
After a full day of touring, we left Oslo by large ferry boat for the overnight trip to Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. After breakfast, we toured in the Bay Area. Copenhagen is surrounded by water, so that was not very hard.
I know. Yeah.
Kronborg Castle was originally a royal summer home, and now exhibits the royal collection, which includes the royal jewels. We had to wait our turn to go inside, so we checked out the gardens while we were waiting. We then took a bus to the Frederiksborg Museum of National History, a former royal castle located on several islands in Copenhagen. It houses period paintings and portraits. We made a short afternoon trip to Elsinore Island Castle, north of Copenhagen. This castle is famous as being the site of William Shakespeare's Hamlet. On the 9th day of our tour, we flew from Copenhagen, Denmark to Stockholm, Sweden. After a short sightseeing trip in the downtown, we went to the Vasa Museum. where it houses the only fully intact Swedish warship with 64 guns. Sadly, it was top-heavy and it sank in the harbor in 1628. It was submerged for 333 years. Then, in 1961, it was raised and salvaged, a process that took 27 years. Downtown Stockholm is also well known as the site of many colorful old buildings, the royal residence, and the site of many of the Nobel Prize Committee's offices and events. We took a side trip to Uppsala, about 45 miles north of Stockholm. It's a beautiful university town and has a long academic history. At one time, it was the capital of Sweden. But the most impressive part are some of its famous alumni. But perhaps the Gustaviana Museum is the most impressive with its collection of artifacts. This human dissection studio was meant to teach new doctors and surgeons. Olaf Rudbeck and his textbook made an important contribution to medicine at the time. Another famous alumni is Carl Linnaeus, a doctor and professor who organized all living plants into categories and gave many of them their Latin names. Now across the street is the cathedral, where early Swedish kings and many famous people are buried. One-thousand-year-old rune stones can be found on campus. A must-see is the Stockholm City Hall. It's the site of the announcement and the awarding ceremonies and parties for the winners of all Nobel Prizes except the Peace Prize. Like all the Baltic capitals, they are right on the Baltic Sea. To visit the private residence of the Swedish king, one needs to go by boat several miles to Drottningholm Palace. While we cannot see the private part, we can see the historic ceremonial parts and the gardens. Drottningholm is also a World Heritage Site. We left Stockholm for Helsinki by an overnight ferry, the Silva Symphony. The food was good, there was entertainment, and the beds were comfortable. We arrived at the Helsinki Sea Terminal, and after breakfast we were met by a city guide who began showing us some Finnish parliament buildings and statues of several historical figures. Our hotel was interesting in that it was small and resembled a medieval monastery. A walk downtown followed. This metal sculpture is dedicated to Finnish composer John Sibelius, who is often credited with helping Finland develop a national identity in its struggle for freedom from Russia. Helsinki is a rocky place. Even streets and churches are carved into the rock. We were up early in the next morning for a quick trip across the Baltic to Estonia. The trip was comfortable, and we were greeted by a young and enthusiastic guide.
We speak Estonian language, and the language will become a very important topic. We are immensely proud of our language, because we're a country that has been occupied way too many times, and somehow this Estonian language is what persevered, and this is basically the proudest thing we're on.
The last stop on our tour was a rail trip to Saint Petersburg, Russia. Our hotel was a very large Holiday Inn and was our headquarters for 3 days. learned to use the subway in St. Petersburg and used it several times as we began our tour of the city's museums and historic places. St. Petersburg is a port on the easternmost edge of the Baltic Sea and is also the mouth of the Neva River, which feeds into the Baltic. St. Petersburg has many grand buildings and churches, in part because of its favorable climate, making it popular with Russian royalty and leadership, but also because it is an historic gateway to the West, presenting a portrait of Russian prosperity and grandeur. Vladimir Putin was born here. After lunch, we visited the most popular tourist attraction, the Hermitage Museum in the former official residence of the Tsars, the Winter Palace Complex. One of St. Petersburg's most famous churches is the Church of the Resurrection, also known as the Church of the Spilt Blood. It was built on the site of the assassination of Emperor Alexander II in 1881. Some say there are more mosaics here than in any other church in the world. Our last visit was to the Versailles of Russia, the Peterhoff Palaces and gardens built by the Russian Tsar Peter the Great. It is located in the southern part of St. Petersburg, fronting on the Baltic Sea. Peterhoff was largely destroyed by German forces in 1941 to 1944. Restoration began after World War II and continues today.